the scriptures, it says in the first chapter, God speaking amongst himself, as it were, says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And we know from Hebrews 1 and other places that Jesus Christ is the image of God. That image that Paul says that when whom he foreknew, he also be predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So the first man and woman were made perfect. I suspect, that they were covered in the Shekinah glory, and that's how they knew that they were naked later on. Anyway, this is written a very long time ago, but for those people who only trust the New Testament, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that lovely chapter on the resurrection, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. So at least St. Paul confirms that he believes Genesis chapter 1. So if you were among the higher critics who thought that this was a wonderful legend, St. Paul's not going along with that. Much more important, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ himself, who's referred to as the creator of all things. He says in Matthew 19, "He that made them at the beginning made them male and female." And somebody said to me the other day, is there a gap between the first two verses? And I pointed to this and said, well, not according to the Lord Jesus Christ. He made them at the beginning, male and female. And he's quoting there from Genesis 1:27, and he's also quoting from Genesis 2:15, because he goes on and says, "For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh." And then he adds, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." This is one of the dreadful things about divorce, isn't it? That you are breaking a solemn promise, an oath. And in God's eyes, that's a terrible thing, as you'll see in many places in the scriptures. The alternative is that man evolved by a purposeless process to become a purposeful man. And his closest relative, a chimpanzee. Now, that's not the only scientific view, of course. Others have pointed out the many differences and have suggested that, no, we were in the water before we came on land. Around 1960, Alistair Hardy, who's a fellow of the Royal Society, so he's got credentials, and he suggested that apes progressed to Homo erectus by having to live in water, either to find food or to avoid predators. It would have put pressure on our ancestors, he says, to start walking upright in order to keep their heads above water. Those of us who've raised children know what that means, to keep your head above water. Such apes would have lost most of their body hair and grown a layer of subcutaneous fat. I read somewhere that you can't, by thinking, add one little bit to your height, but he thinks so. The idea that man evolved from something, perhaps from some primordial protoplasm, has found support from a man called Haeckel, a German from the University of Jena at the end of the 19th century. And Darwin, in fact, thought that this was the best evidence for his theory. He said that the embryo, never mind about this mumbo-jumbo at the top, the embryo starts off as a single cell, just like in the beginning there was just that simple single bit of protoplasm that eventually developed into everything. It, at some point, has gill slits, just like the fish ancestry, which was known, of course, to Aristotle, and eventually it develops a tail, and that shows our simian ancestry, and is finally born a man-child. Well, of course, the single cell doesn't represent anything like a protozoan, because it has all the potential for developing into a human, and it's got cells which develop, which copy one another, divide, differentiate, and bits of it become different parts of the animal. Similarly, the gill slits are not really anything to do with respiration. They're just folds which later become part of the pharynx and so on, jaw. And the tail is there sticking out because the limbs grow much faster in the embryo than the backbone. The backbone and the head grow more slowly, so they appear to be bigger. And incidentally, Haeckel didn't emphasize the fact that our ancestors might have been very large-headed, because that would have been the opposite to what he wanted to say, that we were brutish. So, that was Haeckel's idea. It was blown out of the water even in Haeckel's day. He was arraigned before a university court and accused of fraud. They said, look, you've changed all these diagrams, that's not the way it really looks. And of course the man in the street doesn't know what it looks like anyway. And he was found guilty by a university court. And yet my children were still taught this at school, and I had to go down and have words with the teacher about it, put him right. Sir Gavin de Beer, who was the director of the British Museum of Natural History, is on record as writing, seldom has an assertion like that of Haeckel's theory of recapitulation, where you recapitulate the or the evolutionary process apparently, facile, tidy and plausible, widely accepted without critical examination, done so much harm to science. The second idea, which seemed to lend credence to the evolutionary idea, was that as we changed from being a fish, so we lost our fins, developed our feet, but we also lost we lost a number of things, and some of them we didn't quite lose, and they're still there in a shriveled up sort of way, like the appendix. And people thought the appendix has no use. In fact, the people took out people's appendix just because it didn't seem to have any use, and they thought, you're better off without that, it's a way of slimming. And also, there's something like 140 vestigial organs, according to scientists of 100 years ago. Nowadays, of course, they found uses for virtually all of them, including the appendix. And I use this quote from Scientific American from last November because it refers to the appendix as having been thought to be vestigial and showing that it actually has a use. So it says, thus, although scientists have long discounted the human appendix as a vestigial organ, there is a growing body of evidence indicating the appendix does in fact have a significant function as a part of the body's immune system. And the thymus, tiny little shriveled organ in man, much more pronounced in some of the other animals, but it implants the idea of self on the embryo, so necessary to prevent invasion of foreign bodies. So, Professor Goodrich, Oxford University, said he would be a rash man indeed who would now assert that any part of the body was useless. The idea of evolution of man was supported by a number of fossil finds. Nowadays, less attention is paid to fossil men, ape men as they're called, and more attention is given to genetic evidence, especially now in the last couple of years that they have got the human genome. But we'll start off with a historical view of one or two of these things. Java Man. The man called Dubois. He was a Dutchman, Eugene Dubois, in the Dutch Navy. He felt sure that man had evolved from the apes because his mentor, Professor Haeckel, had told him so. And so he set out to Java, knowing that that was a pretty remote place and the sort of place you might find an ape-man fossil. And sure enough, he did find some. He found a skull cap. He himself, much later, suggested that it was that of a giant gibbon. But he also found this femur, which is a leg bone, and Professor Virchow at the time said that is a human femur. It shows some disease, but nevertheless it is a human femur. So you've got an ape-like skull cap, you've got a human femur, and you have an upright walking ape man, obviously very, very early on in our evolution. Dubois also found some fully human skulls in the same place. These two were found something like 15 meters apart and of different levels in the rock layers, but he didn't mention that. The Wojak skulls also he didn't mention. He put them away in a cupboard. It was only about 30 years later that he got them out and embarrassed everybody by saying, I found these alongside this Java man. Haeckel was delighted about this. He encouraged Dubois to lecture all over Europe, and Haeckel said, truly a Pliocene remainder of that famous group of the higher Catarrhines, which were the immediate pithecoid ancestors of man. He's indeed the long search for missing link. Haeckel was into words like that, as we saw from ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It gives an air of respectability to the whole thing to give names like that to them. You'll find that scientists do it all the time. Sir Grafton Elliot Smith, an English fellow of the Royal Society, said the amazing thing had happened. Dubois had actually found the fossil his scientific imagination had visualized. And Dubois constructed a model of this, and not only the bones themselves, but he fleshed it out, lots of details, in fact embarrassing details of the whole man, and copies of this were made for all the universities and museums all around the world, because this was the first ape man and confirmed Darwin's theory. Fine details of anatomy were shown there, and G.K. Chesterton put it like this. He said, people talked of Pithecanthropus as of Pitt or Fox or Napoleon. Popular history has published portraits of him, like the portraits of Charles I or George IV. A detailed drawing was reproduced, carefully shaded, to show the very hairs of his head were all numbered. No uninformed person, looking at its carefully limbed face, would imagine for a moment that this was the portrait of a thigh bone, of a few teeth, and of a fragment of a cranium. Now, in the late 1930s, another scientist, anthropologist by the name of von Koenigswald, went out to Java hoping to find more of Java man. And he said to his native workers, he said, every piece of bone that you can find, I will pay you 10 cents for. Now, these chaps weren't quite as primitive as von Koenigswald imagined. When they found a big piece, they hammered it until they'd got lots of little pieces. Incidentally, it's mentioned in the New Scientist last year that Dubois' papers were censored after his death. The same is said about Darwin's letters as well, censoring out any idea that he might have had second thoughts about it. In 1908, some workmen at Piltdown Farm in Sussex, near the town of Uckfield, found a skull cap, which it was more of a skull. They called it a bone coconut, and they found this. A man called Dawson, who was a solicitor in Uckfield, and that firm of Dawson and Hart, I think it is, are still operating in Uckfield. He had said to them, if you find anything interesting, do let me know, because he'd got a reputation for finding things. He had, for instance, found he'd seen a sea serpent off of the pier at Hastings. So he was a man of scientific imagination as well. And having found this, he got some of his friends in from the British Museum who were very interested. After all, if the Dutch had Java Man, surely the British could find an early Englishman as well. And they got Sir Arthur Smith Woodward and Davidson Black of the British Museum, Natural History Museum. Davison Black, of course, went on to find Pekin Man along with Teilhard de Chardin. And in fact, Teilhard de Chardin, as a young man, a young priest, working in Surrey, came over to help with the investigation on Piltdown Farm. They found an ape-like lower jaw, but its teeth were like those of a man. They were flat, and the whole thing was yellow with age. It was obvious that these two had belonged together, even though the point at which they articulated, the point at which the jaw hinge was, had unfortunately broken, and so you couldn't be absolutely sure that the skull and the jaw belonged to the same creature, but clearly they were found in the same place. No reasonable person would doubt this. And so Piltdown Man was born. Here's a picture of Sir Arthur Keefe unveiling memorial at Piltdown on July the 22nd in 1938. This memorial is still there, and if you can get permission from the landowners, you can go and look at it. The inscription runs like this: "Here in the old river gravel, Mr. Charles Dawson, FSA, found the fossil skull of Piltdown Man between 1912 and 1913. The discovery was described by Mr. Charles Dawson and Sir Arthur Smith Woodward in the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society, 13 to 15. So the various finds were documented in that particular quarterly journal, which means that it can be certainly trusted. Other fossil bones were found. There was what they called an elephant bat. It was a part of an elephant's thigh, and it looked a bit like a cricket bat. And they also found a tooth belonging to this ape man, which later turned out, 1915 and so on, that you couldn't be sure that a tooth was radioactive. Radioactivity was hardly known at that time, but nevertheless, it turned out later that the tooth was radioactive, and that was important, as we'll see. And Sir Arthur Keefe, this fellow here, he wrote in his book, The Antiquity of Man, that we should discover such a race as Piltdown sooner or later has been an article of faith in the anthropologist's creed ever since Darwin's time. Notice the pseudo-religious writing there. It is, in fact, faith. Several hundred doctoral theses were written on Piltdown Man. I haven't heard of anybody having their PhD rescinded because Piltdown Man turned out to be not what it would seem, but there we are. There were hundreds of reconstructions, again, in all the universities and all the museums all around the world. And then in 1951, they did fluorine tests on the jaw and on the skull. Now, that's to see the percentage of fluoride in the bones. Bone is made of apatite, which is a calcium phosphate, and fluoride ions in groundwater replace some of the phosphate and produce what's known as fluorapatite. And by looking at the amount of fluoride, you can at least say these two bones are the same age. They have the same proportion of fluoride in them. It depends a lot on the porosity of the bone, on the age of the bone, on how long it's been in the groundwater, how much fluoride there is in the groundwater, and so on. So it doesn't give an accurate chronology, but nevertheless, it could tell you that these were the same age, and of course they expected it to be, but unfortunately they found that they were different ages. They reckoned that the skull cap might have been 500 years old and human, and the jaw turned out to be modern. It only looked old because whoever had put it there had coloured it with a chemical which makes it yellow, a potassium dichromate. But what about the teeth? They surely, it was an ape jaw, they established that, but the teeth had been carefully ground down, and if you look at it under a microscope, you can actually see the scratch marks of the file to see that these teeth had been ground down to look as though they were human. In other words, it was a deliberate fraud. And it's interesting that nobody really wanted to see whether it was genuine or not when they were first found in the 1910, 12, and so on. They were happy to accept it as it was, and so no one really looked to see this obvious fraud. And it fooled people for so long, 40 years, experts, fellows of the Royal Society, because they wanted to believe it. It was a part of their creed, as Sir Arthur Keefe said. Now, various people were blamed for this. Dawson was the obvious person. He died in 1916, so he wasn't there to defend himself. I suspect that Charles Dawson was a bumbling idiot, but there we are. He's not there to defend himself from me either. I don't think he was a fraudster, but I think that probably one of the people working with him, either from the British Museum or the Vatican, was a fraudster. M.A.C. Hinton of the British Museum has been blamed as well, because somebody found quite recently a bag, a leather bag with MACH stamped upon it, and inside it a number of bones on which somebody had evidently been testing out dichromate for colouring and filing teeth down. So it would look like a smoking gun. I have to say that Hinton wasn't around either when they found this. He died, so he couldn't defend himself, and whoever had actually perpetrated it was certainly capable of planting a bag like that as well. So I wouldn't imagine that could be taken too seriously. A letter to the New Scientist in January of 1971 said that the local people suspected Teilhard de Chardin, but he's a priest, so it's unlikely. The problem was that the elephant tooth, the elephant bat rather, had been traced to the Dordogne, and Teilhard de Chardin had been born near the Dordogne in France. Also, the dichromate. He was a lecturer in chemistry in North Africa, at Cairo, actually. The radioactive tooth, because of its radioactivity profile, was traced to Tunisia, also in North Africa. So, maybe a coincidence, anyway. Louis Leakey, who's not as kind as me, he said in his book, Unveiling Man's Origin, there can be no doubt that at least one of the people involved in making the forgeries must have had considerable knowledge of chemistry, as well as some training in geology and human anatomy. The perpetrators also must have had access to fossil bones from outside of Great Britain. That is a photo fit of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Back in America, they were looking enviously at the Dutch and the British with their early men, and they thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had our own ape man? And about that time, there was a politician named Bryan. That was his surname. I've got to be careful here. I was speaking in a big church in Edinburgh, and the pastor's first name was Bryan, and I talked about a politician named Bryan, and everybody burst out laughing. So anyway, this chap Bryan was running for president, and he was saying that evolution shouldn't be taught in schools. And at the same time, Professor Henry Fairfield Osborne in Nebraska was saying, yes, we do want it taught in schools. And then they found this tooth in Nebraska, and Osborne was quite sure that this belonged to an ape man. You could almost tell that it couldn't speak, for instance, by looking at this tooth. And Osborne had been across to the British Museum and seen the remains of Eoanthropus, that's Piltdown Man, and he was delighted with this. It was 1922, and in England, Sir Grafton Elliot Smith, in a book called Evolution of Man, he wrote, two extinct genera, Pithecanthropus, that's Java, and Eoanthropus, that's Piltdown, it is now proposed to add a third, Hesperopithecus, That's Nebraska Man, the ape man of the Western world. The Scopes trial took place in 1925, and it was a milestone in history of evolutionism in America. A man had been accused of teaching evolution. In fact, they'd got hold of somebody who'd never actually taught evolution, and they used this tooth as evidence. And Osborne declared, the earth spoke to Brian from his own state of Nebraska. The Hesperopithecus tooth is like a still small voice. Its sound is by no means easy to hear, and I'd agree with that. This little tooth speaks volumes of truth in that it affords evidence of man's descent from the apes. They made a film about it, Inherit the Wind, and a travesty of the court case, and they've just made a second version of it now, just as bad. It was used to hammer creationism, and a few years later they found some more teeth, and this time they were attached to a jaw. And of course, the more you know about something, the more you can decide exactly what it is, and it turned out to be a pig. Professor W.R. Thompson, FRS, he was the president of the Commonwealth Institute at the time, and he wrote in his introduction to Everyman edition of Origin of Species in 1956, he said the success of Darwinism was accompanied by a decline in scientific integrity. This is already evident in the reckless statements of Haeckel, the alteration of the Piltdown skull. A similar instance of tinkering with evidence was finally revealed in the discoverer of Pithecanthropus. In other words, there's a lot of jiggery-pokery going on here. And when they find a skull, like this one of Louis Leakey, was not his skull, it's what he found, called it Zinjanthropus, also called popularly Nutcracker Man, he got people to draw what they thought might be the ape man. Various people, and I've got 3 examples here, there are 5 in a book that we offer, and you can see the soft parts, you make it up as you go along, the nose and the chin and the look in the eye. You know, you can be a philosopher, or you can be a very cheerful ape, or you can just be a dozy looking chimpanzee. There is a difficulty. People want to be famous, and Dr. Tim White, who's an anthropologist at University College of Berkeley, he wrote rather self-righteously in New Scientist in April of 1983, under an article, Hominid Collarbone Exposed as Dolphin's Rib. He says, the problem of a lot of anthropologists is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. Well, later on, you've probably guessed it, Nature, September 94, reported 17 fossil bones in Ethiopia, said by Dr. Tim White to belong to an ancestor of man. So there he is doing it again. Very thing that he accused others of doing. And the newspapers called it the oldest human ancestor. But then National Geographic in March 1996 reports that White has since found an almost complete skeleton that shows it to be chimp-like and not an ancestor of man. And of course newspapers don't say, oh, I'm sorry, but the earliest ancestor of man hasn't been found after all. Remember what he said? The problem with a lot of anthropologists is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. There's so much difference between man and ape, and here's just one highlighted here. You can see that the toe is very close up against the other toes in man, and perhaps after the lecture, and I've gone away, you could all get your socks off and have a look yourselves. And then again, in an ape, you've got the feet very much like the hand, with opposing thumbs so that it can support itself on the tree and be holding something in its other foot and using its arms to cuddle its baby. And Dr. James Fanu, who's a great friend of creationists, writes in the Sunday Telegraph, this is November of 2000, he says, man's foot, it's tightly bound to the other toes, both to support the body's weight and to act as a lever for stepping forward. By contrast, the first digit of the simian foot is opposed for grasping, like the hand. And this is a quote from this article. He says, a comparison of the feet of primates and humans. This primates, of course, is apes, not archbishops. He says the comparison of the feet of primates and humans would seem to refute rather than confirm that Darwinian theory of evolution. Another of the physical differences is in the ear. The inner ear is hard bone, and it's usually it's preserved in the fossil, and so we can look not just at our own ears, but at fossil ears as well, or at least the fossil skull in the inner ear, and look at the balance mechanism. The semicircular canals, the labyrinth as it's called, they're canals filled in life with liquid and with little hairs coming out from the wall on the inside, and as you move yourself around, so the liquid moves, the hairs pick up this movement and tell you that you're going to lose your balance. And that's why if you spin yourself round and then stand up, because this is still spinning in your ear, you tend to fall over. And because man walks on 2 feet, his balance has to be much more exact. And so it's quite a complex pattern in the ear. But for knuckle-walking apes, the pattern is very different and much simpler. Nature, June 1994, it says brain scans of fossilized skulls can distinguish between ape-like creatures that walked on all fours and man who walked upright. The part of the inner ear that controls balance is known as the labyrinth. It's a canal full of fluid with hairs that sense the flow of fluid during movement. Apes don't need such an acute sense of balance, so they have labyrinths of a different shape to man. And among the fossil hominids, this same thing goes on to say, the earliest species to demonstrate the modern human morphology is Homo erectus. So Homo erectus is a genuine man, and he's reckoned to be at the bottom of the Homo scale. In contrast, the semicircular canal dimensions in crania from southern Africa, attributed to Australopithecus, resemble those of the extinct great apes. So Australopithecus is supposed to have changed into Homo erectus, but according to the labyrinths, they're quite distinct. So not just the feet, but the ears as well. And then there's the language problem. If you've ever tried to talk to a monkey, you'll know that it doesn't work. There have been ladies, there are always lady scientists who seem to adopt these monkeys and try and persuade themselves that they're getting messages back when they talk, and they show them things, and the monkeys sort of grab a banana and eat it or something, and they say, well, there you are. But Nature in 1996, it says, as attempts to teach language to other species have consistently shown, syntax most sharply distinguishes humans from non-humans, and therefore stands in most need of evolutionary explanation. What it's not quite saying, but what it means is we don't have a clue. There's no evolutionary explanation of why man can speak and have not just grunts, but whole words and sentences and constructs, and can express himself on abstract subjects. And of course, apes can't. New Scientist in December 1998 says that, quite simply, language is our medium. In spite of this, how it evolved remains among the most speculative areas of research into human origins. Too much of it is, as one observer has put it, inferences based on hunches. No wonder then that anthropologists' speculations have long been as controversial as they are imaginative. The reason that we can speak is that we have a bone, or at least one of the reasons, is that we have a bone called the hyoid bone, and the hyoid bone is arrowed in that diagram there, and it holds the human larynx in place and permits speech. Neanderthals possess this bone. Modern man possesses it. Apes, of course, don't. Susan Greenfield, I think she's the wife of Peter Atkins, isn't she? And is therefore also an atheist, I'm pretty sure. And she's talking about the wonders of this, and she says the larynx of the human baby is situated high in the throat so that it can form a seal over the airway, allowing food and drink to be consumed without choking. That's a good design thing, isn't it, in babies? Monkeys and apes retain the high larynx, but at the age of about 2 years, the human larynx descends to a lower position that allows us to articulate a full range of sounds as we begin to speak. This low position would be dangerous in a baby. It would choke, of course, as the liquids went down into the airways. So that's a design feature, and that's one of the reasons why it is that once a baby gets to about 2 years old, it starts to say dada or mama or whatever. Now, it was reported in 1996 that a group of deaf young children in Nicaragua, during the Sandinista regime, when they were completely ignored because there was no votes in it, they were left to their own devices, and they quickly developed their own sign language from scratch. It had structure, grammar, and consistency, allowing even the discussion of abstract ideas. 5-year-olds quickly picked up the language, but older children had difficulty. Do you remember how you struggled with Latin and Greek at school? But you picked up English from your mother. If you're German, it would be your mutter's tongue, one that you mutter with. Scientific American, February 1996, says, world expert in linguistics Noam Chomsky contends that speech is inborn in children. Now, if you've got an inborn software for speech, you must have a programmer as well, mustn't you? I like this. It's a letter in the New Scientist in March 2000, and it says, your report from the American Association for the Advancement of Science suggests that unless a person learns language before he's 5, they never become fluent, because the brain no longer has the potential for learning skill. This immediately suggests to me that language must have been created by infants in our evolutionary past. It could hardly have been invented by adults whose brains have no longer the capacity for developing language skills. Because that's the only explanation, unless you say that it was hardwired into us as children. But since that's a rather religious idea, then you're reduced to this absurd idea. Not just feet, ears, language, but also the ability to use tools. Now, birds can use tools. Apes, of course, if they use a tool, it's splashed across the front page of the newspaper, and you don't mention that you can set a sheepdog to look after monkeys, but you can't set a monkey to look after a crowd of sheepdogs. But prehistoric spears have been found beautifully balanced, with the denser end of the wood at the front. You know that the denser end is nearer the bole of a tree trunk, isn't it? And they use that fact, and they found these spears reckoned to be umpteen years old, but beautifully balanced and as good as anything that you could make today. Also, archaeologists have discovered a 9,000-year-old Chinese bone flute. Don't worry about the dating system. It's full of assumptions. And they'd managed to play a tune on it. The thing had a tone scale which is rather similar to our present-day do-re-mi tone scale. That makes you wonder if there isn't something wired into the human brain that responds to a particular series of notes. That's not my comment. This is a quotation from New Scientist, September of 1999. More recently, in April of last year, New Scientist reported fossil teeth of 2 individuals discovered in Pakistan and dated at 8,000 to 9,000 years old, had been drilled with a stone bit, and that happened while the person still had the teeth embedded in their jaw and continued to use it for eating, because you could tell by the wear pattern that it was chewed after, the bones were used for chewing after they'd been drilled out. So this person had been to a dentist. Early man had an advanced culture. Some of you will have seen the film Rain Man, I expect, and you know that some autistic savants have notable talents in maths, music, some other direction. One may be able to tell the time accurately without looking at a clock. That would be useful for a speaker up here. Another can measure length accurately by eye. Another can speak many different languages fluently. I would suggest to you that Adam, who was made in the image of God, had an extraordinary brain in every direction, and people marveled that he could have named all the animals on that first afternoon of the sixth day, before Eve was made. But if he had the sort of skills that you see in particular directions for autistic savants, but he had them in every direction, then he'd have been quite a character. And of course he walked with God in the garden, as Jacob was saying just now, and would have picked up all sorts of information. I remember walking with my father and plying him with questions, and he always seemed to know the answer, and it would have been a bit like that, only much more so with Adam and Eve. And living for 930 years too, of course, he'd have gained a lot of experience himself, and he'd have gone to see the Lord at the entrance of the Garden of Eden with his sacrifices at regular intervals, no doubt, as he taught his son Abel to do. So imagine the sort of information that Adam had. And Adam knew Methuselah over many, many years. And Methuselah's grandchild Noah, Adam by that time having died, and that's the tragedy of Genesis 5, that little phrase, and he died, because he wasn't intended to die. He was intended to go on living. But he fouled it up, as we know. Noah would have taken a lot of this information with him on board of Noah's Ark, wouldn't he? And early man was able to do all sorts of things in astronomy, in music, in metallurgy, shifting great stones and setting them up exactly, and that sort of thing. Man's brain, it's got 10 to the power 11 neurons connected at 10 to the power 14 synapses. And in Physics World for September 1999, it says, Altogether, the human nervous system and brain form what is undoubtedly the most powerful, complex, and least understood signal processing network in the universe. Of course, it came by chance, and some monkey developed it. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Dr. Jack Crusoe, head of the orthodontic section of a hospital in New Jersey, has studied the teeth of Neanderthal remains in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. He says, I found that Neanderthals lived longer lives than we do today, and that their children had later maturation times than modern children. You remember, if you look in Genesis chapter 5, it tells you about when they first had children, and Enoch, I remember, seemed to have his first child, whose name was Methuselah, at the age of 65. Well, that's quite late for having children. But he went on living after that. He didn't live as long as his son, although his son died before him. Now, that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Methuselah walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And I guess every day he walked a little bit further with God until one day God said, look, you're nearer my place than yours, let's come home with me. Anyway, this Dr. Jack Crusoe says, through anatomical studies and a series of standardized radiographs similar to the ones utilized by orthodontists across the world, I've been able to calculate the Neanderthal lifespan in southwestern France to between 250 and 300 years. Now, when you read about that in Genesis 5, Genesis 11, you think to yourself, I wonder how that was. But here we have an orthodontist using standard tests and confirming it. And these Neanderthals would have lived maybe about the time of Abraham, or even earlier. Now, we've been talking about fossils, but more recently, and we're now moving to August 95, we can talk about the genetics. And people look at mitochondrial DNA in women, Y chromosomal genes in men, to work out the differences between the different ethnic groups and try and work back from that to date when man first came on the scene and woman first came on the scene. I suspect that men and women arrived on the scene at the same time. It does seem to make sense, doesn't it? The scientists themselves are confused, the Sunday Times says. A series of recent discoveries has forced them to tear up the simplistic charts on which they blithely used to draw linkages from Australopithecus africanus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. That's us. The classic family tree delineating man's descent from the apes, familiar to us from school, has given way to the concept of genetic islands. They're not connected, you see. The bridge work between them is anyone's guess. So looking at the genetics, which is a much more exacting science than Eugene Dubois going to Java and digging up a couple of bones 15 meters apart and saying, look, here's the mitochondrion of the cell. You've got the nucleus of the cell there and the cell wall, and you've got the various bits of the cell around the nucleus, including the mitochondria. And there's an expanded view of the mitochondria, the bit that converts food into energy. And they've looked at the mitochondria of women from different ethnic groups and the differences between them. And they've worked back using estimates for the mutation rate in mitochondrial DNA. And they say mitochondrial Eve, as they called her, because she was the mother of all living, the real mother, of course, not this mythical one in the Bible. She is estimated from mutation rates to have lived 140,000 years ago. And that's actually very recent, because when you talk about fossil remains, they always talk in terms of millions of years. So there's a problem here for the fossil men, that it's only 140,000 years ago, but of course you're still trying to say it's a lot more than biblical history. And then when you look at Y chromosome Adam, he lived 50 to 70,000 years ago. Look how Eve managed before that. More than ever, it says, this means we're sitting in the same boat. And if you then look at Nature Genetics, volume 15, number 4, 1997, you find that it gives measured rates of mitochondrial DNA mutations. And you work it out, and they're 20 times those previously estimated. And so you divide that 140,000 years by 20, and mitochondrial Eve was only some 7,000 years ago, and Adam 4,000 years ago, which means we know which boat they were all sitting in. And people say chimpanzees and men are only maybe 2% different in their DNA. It's quite obvious that they're very closely related. Well, the human genome is thought to contain 30 to 40,000 genes, but the fruit fly, that little dot with wings, contains some 13,000 genes, and many of the genes of Drosophila melanogaster are very similar to our own, and some are interchangeable. So it's not just chimps that we're similar to, it's even these tiny little fruit flies. Now, there's a picture of a nematode worm, which is only 1 millimeter long, and it's got less than 1,000 body cells, and yet it's quite complex. It's got a nervous system, it's got muscles, digestive system, and it can reproduce sexually. It has 20,000 genes, that's about half the number in man, and 97 million nucleotides, which is a lot less than man, but nevertheless quite a few. And nearly 3/4 of human genes have some counterpart in nematodes, which are millimeter-long soil-dwelling worms. This is reported in the New Scientist for May 1999. And it says, but that doesn't mean that a worm is 3/4 of the way to becoming a person. What we can say is that the Lord produced them both, but not only did he make man in his image, but one of his prophets going to Nineveh, it says, God made a worm. And in the Psalms, that man says, I'm a worm and no man. Now, the New Scientist for 1998, February, it says our DNA contains, well, it says 80,000, but now we reckon it's more like 30 to 40,000 genes that control all the workings of our bodies. This is the interesting thing, yet amid this complexity, even the tiniest of errors can be devastating. Fatal diseases such as sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis are caused by simple inherited genetic defects. Similarly, damage to DNA can trigger the kind of uncontrolled cell growth that leads to cancer. So, amidst all this complexity, just one amino acid in the 6th position in one of the strands of the globin of blood cells produces sickle cell anemia, for instance. And yet, neo-Darwinism mechanism is that mutations, then selected by the environment, natural selection, produce improvements, and so we move from single-celled creatures to man over billions of years. And yet, little mutations can be devastating. You have to be really optimistic to say that mutations plus natural selection is a mechanism for progress in evolution. I'm going to give you a press cutting now, which is an interview with a geneticist working on the human genome, and it comes from a newspaper called The Ledger. It's an American one. The interviewer says, the person being interviewed says, the work that I do in genetic research is honourable. We will find the cures to many of mankind's worst diseases. But in the meantime, we have to live with the elephant in the living room. To which the interviewer says, what elephant? And he replies, creation design. It moves like an elephant in the living room. It moves around, takes up an enormous amount of space, trumpets loudly, bumps into us, knocks things over, eats a ton of hay and smells like an elephant. And yet we have to swear it isn't there. And that's from Lynchburg, Virginia, 17th of February 2000, an actual interview. We have to ignore creation because we can only talk in science in terms of things we can measure. Naturalism. The New Scientist in January 1998 says, evolutionary stories are, almost by definition, just so stories, like Rudyard Kipling's explanation of how the elephant got its trunk. Oh, my best beloved. And in April 2000, something similar. And so we get absurdly circular just so stories. Women who don't kill their babies don't kill them because of evolution. But on the other hand, if they do kill their babies, that must also be because of evolution. A theory that explains everything might just as well be discarded, since it plainly has no explanatory value. The other thing about evolution is that anything can be said because very little can be disproved. That's from New Scientist. Another actual example here of a just so story. This is from the Times for August 1997, and it reports the finding of 3 fossil human footprints 60 miles north of Cape Town, South Africa. And it says, physically, she was the same as us, although not as developed mentally. Walking upright, with jutting jaw, high forehead, and without the protruding eyebrow ridges, of early man. This is from 3 fossil human footprints. It doesn't say whether she was wearing a hat. What a vast return of conjecture for such trifling investment of fact. I'd like to tell you a cautionary tale about the making of man. It is a just-so story, I have to admit. Once upon a time, the evolutionary scientists were feeling very pleased with themselves. The great human genome project had been completed thanks to a new fast method of sequencing genes. Yet another theory on how life had arrived on Earth made them confident that before long they'd be able to produce life in their laboratories. God, they said, shaking their corporate fist towards heaven, you're finished, redundant, primitive myth. Really, replied the Almighty, I didn't know. But who will run things if I'm not here? Who? Asked the experts incredulously. Why, man will run the earth, nay, the universe. Our scientific know-how will enable us to build a future free from dogma. One day we expect to create eternal life. You can create life? Asked God. Why, yes, said the biologist. We can already clone creatures, and test tube babies are yesterday's technology. Could you make a man? Asked God. Why, certainly. Given a little more time and plenty of funding, even making a man in the lab will be possible. Yes, but can you make a man as I made him from the dust of the earth? Well, yes, eventually, of course we could. We're entering a technological explosion. Soon there'll be nothing that man cannot do. A tower to reach to heaven, that's modern science. Well, go to it then, said God. Supremely confident, the scientists began to gather up sacks of dust. What do you think you're doing? Asked God. We're collecting the dust to take it back to the laboratories in order to research how to make living man from its elements. Like you did, they replied. Oh, no, said God. You make your own dust. It says in Romans 5:12, wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, so that all have sinned. And we know that from our own experience, don't we? What it's saying there is that there was no death before sin. And therefore there couldn't have been millions of years of evolution, which relied upon survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. Adam sinned, and the first death was to produce aprons to cover their nakedness. The first blood sacrifice. If it wasn't so, then we can't say that the wages of sin is death, as Romans 6:23 tells us. And also we can't say that the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And we can't say that the blood of Jesus Christ, God's Son, cleanses us from all sin. Scripture says that as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And if you don't believe in the first Adam, then the last Adam can't be relied upon to cleanse you from your sin. But the good news is that as we have borne the image of the earthy, you remember that the first man was of the earthy, but the second man is the Lord from heaven, and as we have borne the image of the earthy, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. That takes us back full circle. We began by quoting from Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. He's the image of the invisible God, and whom he did foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. There's not a lot of sign of it yet, but we shall be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. And when we shall see him, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Thank you.